Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to touch on something that we often overlook as storytellers, and that as players we tend to completely ignore because it makes our jobs a lot harder. But in short, the real world, the world that we live in, and the world that these games emulate, does not allow for rapid, quick change to be made, especially not just by overcoming a single opponent or a single obstacle. The real world is made up of power structures, concepts, and ideas, and these are not things that you can very easily overcome. But a lot of the time in our games, we boil things down so much that that's what it turns into, and I feel that does both a disservice to the setting, but also it can really take out something special when we boil it down to just another conflict between individuals. For an example of what I'm talking about, think back to Lord of the Rings, since it's one of the genre staples of high fantasy. I am going somewhere with this, trust me, come along on the journey. But in that setting, think back to when Sauron was defeated. You know, we have the Lord of all evil with his extremely powerful evil ring, his armies are being fought, and his empire is expanding, but then we defeat him. He's not killed, obviously, or we wouldn't have any more stories, but he is defeated as an individual. And with his defeat, everything around him crumbles. The campaign ceases to move forward, Mordor pulls back within its own borders. Our heroes are victorious, and we move on with the rest of the story. It's very epic, and it's very fantastical. It's also in no way representative of how things work in the real world. Take Vampire, for example. Let's say you have a very powerful prince. They rule major cities. Let's say LA, New York, Chicago, whatever area it is the Camarilla has hold of. This individual, whether they personally have a great deal of power, they are very old, they have a lot of disciplines on their sheet, they have a lot of XP, whether their princedom, fiefdom, whatever we want to call it, is particularly potent, they have a lot of people who bend the knee, they have a lot of supporters, they have a lot of people to do their bidding. Ask what happens if you get rid of that prince. Sure, you may have thrown things into chaos a little bit. You may have ended whatever their personal machinations were. Maybe. But you haven't gotten rid of the entire entrenched political structure. There will be another prince. And even if that city is somehow liberated, if this particular seat of power is no longer part of the Camarilla, if it has a new governing structure, or it has some new thing perhaps the Carthians are putting together, that doesn't remove those entrenched power structures from the rest of the setting, the rest of the world, nor does it mean there's not going to be retaliation when they find out what's happened. And that's sort of what I'm talking about when it comes to overcoming ideas and overcoming structures rather than overcoming individuals. Because overcoming an individual, no matter how powerful that individual is usually possible. Whether we're talking about fighting a single true fae, or we're talking about defeating an individual bridge burner, or we're talking about killing a very specific mage, or finally killing a very specific hunter who's been running a one-man war on the supernatural community. That can be done. But killing a person doesn't change a structure. It doesn't remove an idea from popular circulation. Put another way, as an example, reach back to Pentex, for those not familiar with this political part of the world of darkness. Pentex is capitalism as an antagonist. It is a very interesting addition to the old setting, and I really wish it had made its way into Chronicles. If it has, please let me know in the comments what book it's in, or where it's mentioned, or what it got translated to, because I'm very curious. But the idea behind Pentex as an antagonist is very useful because you can defeat an individual president, or CEO, or company, or LLC. But once you do that, there'll be another one tomorrow. And if you defeat that one, there'll be another one the day after that. because you haven't removed the system that makes these things happen. You haven't stopped the benefit that these companies have or the resources they're trying to go after. You're just cutting heads off the Hydra and doing your best to stay one step ahead of the process. Another example of this, if you take street gangs in the world of darkness, let's say that you have one you have to deal with for whatever reason. It's something that happens in most games, particularly if there are organized crime elements involved. Let's say that you have one that you were opposed to, and you take the obvious solution of like, well, we fight them, because that's what you do. You're given a violent situation, you give it a violent solution. What happens the next day when that power vacuum you created is filled by someone else? Because as long as there is a reason for that gang to exist, as long as there's profit to be made, someone will be there trying to make it. Whether that's elements of the drug trade, whether there's a protection racket going on, whether it's just turf to expand your influence, people are going to want that. And if you happen to get rid of one gang, another one's going to take its place. Or a larger organization who maybe considered it not worth the effort suddenly sweeps in to set up shop. And that is a much more difficult thing to deal with, because it's not just fighting the tide of syndicates and organized crime. It's asking, what are the situations that make these things necessary, that let them flourish? So now you have to deal not just with the issue that there are people running around doing drive-by shootings and selling drugs, but you have that question of, why is poverty pushing so many people into an illegal jobs market? Why is the drug trade flourishing here? What are the conditions that require that to exist? Why is human trafficking being allowed to happen here? What would stop that from being a profitable enterprise? And these things are much more complicated to deal with, and the answers are often significantly less simple, and they might not even be something that you can institute as individual characters or even as a group of individual characters. This is often where you need to reach out and get NPCs involved. You need to make sure that your influence is being used and peddled in an important way. You have to make sure that your resources are being put to enact these more gradual changes. And while that may not be as flashy, it may not be as heroic, it may not use a lot of your supernatural powers, it is important to ask yourself how these things work and what the organic response is going to be to the actions your players take in this case. Because if we are emulating the real world, even if it has supernatural elements attached to it, those supernatural elements often have their own entrenched power structures, as mentioned with vampires and the Camarilla. Changelings have courts, werewolves have their tribal councils. Everything runs on structures and ideas. And changing structural problems, dealing with structural issues, is a lot harder to do than rolling initiative and emptying your magazine at the thread of the week. But you should have that as a consideration when you're a storyteller and you're asking, how much progress are my players making? Are they tackling the right problems? Because a lot of the time, we oversimplify things to the point that once our players have overcome whoever the head of an organization is, whoever our Sauron is, we just sort of assume that everything else crumbles and we can move on to the next thing. But just because you managed to shoot the CEO of a company that was taking advantage of a marginalized community, that doesn't mean the company stops existing. The next person who comes in might take that example and they might decide we're going to be slightly more ethical in the way that we do things. Or they might just decide, I need a better security detail and we're just going to keep doing what the last guy was doing because that was making us big profits and that's not going to stop. So the next time you're putting together a plot, particularly when you're looking at your antagonist, ask yourself, what do they represent beyond themselves? What entrenched power structure do they represent? And what are the systemic things that players are going to have to deal with? Because too often we ignore that and we do it to our own detriment, because it often means that very complicated problems that could take a lot of time and energy and effort and a lot of creativity on the part of our players just end up being dropped or ignored once the big, important, flashy part of the threat has been dealt with. And that really does make the world feel less special and a lot less interesting. Whereas a lot of the time, if you keep those systemic aspects of things, it can also allow people who have a more varied skill set to step in and make progress in ways that those with bigger, more violent skills might not be able to do so. So a diversity of tactics, as it were, can make for a much more interesting game, especially when it leads to your players thinking outside the box and dealing with issues in ways you didn't expect. So for my fellow storytellers out there, keep that in mind, and let's see. We have some interesting stuff coming up. There's some new projects that I'm hoping to do beyond the normal scope of this show. And it's something that I'm hoping you all are really going to enjoy, but I don't want to drop too many spoilers yet in the event that this takes longer than I think it will. But stay tuned, watch this channel, please subscribe if you haven't, hit that bell, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Azukail Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.